The city shimmered under a weak winter sun, the skyscrapers rising like steel titans above the streets below. Snow flurries whirled in the wind, settling on the windshields of idling cars. From behind the wheel of a sleek black sedan, Nathan watched the people rushing by, bundled in coats, their breath visible in the chill air. He wrapped his gloved fingers around the steering wheel, the leather soft and smooth beneath his touch. Nathan was a driver, not just for anyone but for Andrew Caldwell, a real estate tycoon whose name made headlines as often as his investments did. It was a job that paid well and demanded silence. The type of silence that left too much space for a man like Nathan to remember things he tried to forget. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching sight of Andrew in the back seat. The millionaire was engrossed in his phone. His jaw set, eyes narrowed at the endless stream of emails and texts demanding his attention. Nathan's eyes returned to the road, his thoughts drifting to the faint ache in his chest. He was 35, with a life that felt perpetually paused. His days blurred into long hours of driving, from meetings to restaurants, from airports to penthouses. His own voice rarely heard above the hum of the engine. The silence of this life suited him, even if it hollowed him out a little more each day. Change of plans, Nathan? Andrew's voice broke through the quiet, clipped and direct. We're going to Eden Ridge. An associate of mine has a private jet waiting. Nathan met his eyes briefly in the rearview mirror. Yes, sir. Eden Ridge, a region known for sprawling estates and billionaires who played by their own rules. It was a world Nathan navigated only by proxy, forever on the outskirts. He couldn't imagine living among those gilded mansions with their secrets hidden behind manicured hedges. The airport was a sleek, minimalist marvel of glass and steel. The private jet waited on the tarmac, the gleaming fuselage reflecting the pale sun. Nathan took the bags from the trunk and followed Andrew across the tarmac, the cold wind biting at his face. A uniformed flight attendant greeted them at the base of the stairs with a practiced smile. Inside the jet, the air was warm, scented faintly with leather and citrus. Nathan took his usual place in the shadows, ready to fade into the background. But then he saw her. She was seated by the window, her gaze fixed on the endless sky outside. The girl, no, he realized the woman, couldn't have been older than 25. She had an air of fragility about her, wrapped in an expensive cream-colored coat, her chestnut hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. Her fingers toyed with the silver bracelet on her wrist, the metal catching the light. Andrew gestured toward her. Nathan, this is Sophia Lennox. Her family owns the Eden Ridge estate we're visiting. Sophia turned, her eyes meeting Nathan's. They were an arresting shade of gray, clear and sharp, yet clouded with something he couldn't quite place. She smiled, a soft, genuine curve of her lips that made the space between them feel momentarily warmer. Nice to meet you, Nathan, she said, her voice gentle but clear. Nathan nodded, his throat tight. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Lennox. Her smile didn't falter. Sophia, please. He glanced at Andrew, who was already settling into his seat and scrolling through his phone. Nathan murmured a polite of course and took his place, the quiet stretching out again. The jet took off smoothly, the world below shrinking to a patchwork quilt of snow-dusted fields and roads. Nathan kept his gaze forward, but he could feel Sophia's presence, a gentle warmth in the otherwise sterile space. Do you enjoy your job, Nathan? She asked suddenly. The question startled him. He turned slightly, meeting her eyes. There was no condescension, no expectation in her expression, just curiosity. It's a good job, he replied, careful and measured. She tilted her head, studying him. That's not what I asked. Her words were soft, but they struck like a stone in a pond, rippling through him. He hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't betray too much. It gives me time to think, he finally said. Sophia's smile faltered, just a fraction. Too much time, maybe? His stomach tightened. She wasn't wrong. But before he could respond, she turned back to the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass. I know what that's like, she murmured. Too much time in your own head. Nathan watched her, the edges of his heart pulling tight. There was something raw in her tone, a sadness carefully concealed behind poise and wealth. It was a familiar loneliness, the kind he recognized from years spent in his own quiet shadows. When they landed, the sun had begun to set, streaking the sky with hues of pink and orange. The Eden Ridge estate stretched before them, a mansion of marble and glass, surrounded by gardens that slumbered under a blanket of snow. Nathan followed Andrew and Sophia through the grand entrance, the air inside warm and perfumed with lilies. The staff moved like ghosts, their faces composed, their movements precise. Every smile, every word seemed rehearsed. Sophia walked ahead, her steps slow, her eyes distant as she surveyed the opulent surroundings. Nathan lingered at the doorway, feeling out of place among the wealth and polish. But his attention was drawn back to her. Sophia paused by a grand staircase, her fingers trailing along the mahogany banister. The staff swirled around her, offering polite greetings and empty smiles. She nodded absently, her eyes dull. And then she turned to Nathan. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like everything around you is a performance?" He frowned, surprised by the vulnerability in her question. "Sometimes," she smiled sadly. "For me, it's all the time." A cold ache settled in his chest. She was surrounded by luxury, by people who catered to her every whim. Yet her loneliness was a palpable thing, a shadow that clung to her like a second skin. Nathan's mind raced, memories of his own isolation flickering behind his eyes. He'd thought their worlds were completely different, his shaped by struggle, hers by privilege. But in that moment, he realized they shared the same ache, the same yearning to be seen, to be real in a world that demanded facades. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. But he held her gaze, letting her see the understanding there. Her smile was faint, almost imperceptible, but it reached her eyes. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted. Two strangers, seemingly unconnected, their lives now tied by a thread of shared loneliness. Neither of them knew how deeply that thread would pull them together, or how the unraveling of secrets would change them forever. The grand dining hall of the Eden Ridge estate was a portrait of cold elegance. A chandelier dripped with crystals, its golden light illuminating a table set for 12, though only 3 seats were filled. Tall windows reflected the flicker of candles and the dying light of the winter evening. The room felt vast, and yet, somehow suffocating. Sophia sat at the head of the table, her posture flawless, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of her plate. She wore a simple emerald dress, the color a stark contrast to her pale skin. Her eyes, though, betrayed her exhaustion, the kind that settled deep in the soul. Nathan stood near the doorway, out of sight, but within earshot. He wasn't supposed to be there, but Andrew had insisted he remain close in case he was needed. The irony wasn't lost on Nathan. Andrew didn't need him for anything beyond appearances. He was part of the set dressing, just another element of the carefully curated performance that seemed to define this place. Andrew sat to Sophia's left, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging the meal in front of him. The clink of silverware on porcelain echoed through the cavernous space, a sound more jarring than it should have been. The staff moved silently, refilling glasses and removing dishes with mechanical precision. Their eyes never lingered, their smiles never reached their eyes. The entire scene felt like a play where everyone knew their lines, but no one remembered why they were performing. "Andrew," Sophia's voice broke the silence, soft but resolute. "Why did you really come here?" Andrew didn't look up from his phone. "Business, Sophia. You know how it is." She sighed, the sound barely audible. "You brought me here under the pretense of a visit, but you haven't looked away from your emails since we landed." He glanced at her then, his eyes hardening slightly. "This is important. You wouldn't understand." Sophia's jaw tightened. "You're right. I don't understand. I don't understand why you asked me to host you when you clearly don't want to be here." Andrew's mouth opened, ready with a retort, but he paused. The air between them thickened, the unspoken weight of years spent orbiting each other, never truly connecting. Nathan shifted in the shadows, a flicker of unease passing through him. He shouldn't be hearing this, but he couldn't force himself to leave. Something in Sophia's voice, that tremor of vulnerability, kept him rooted to the spot. "Do you know what it's like, Andrew?" Sophia's voice was barely a whisper now. "To live in a house filled with people who pretend to care? To have every conversation scripted, every interaction choreographed?" Andrew's expression faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "Sophia, that's not. I'm not talking about you," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I'm talking about all of this. The staff, the guests, even the walls. They're all part of the same empty play." Her words settled into the air like a shroud. No one moved. The staff paused momentarily before resuming their tasks, their expressions frozen in polite disinterest. Andrew's eyes softened, the hard edge of his demeanor cracking just slightly. "Sophia, you've always had everything you could want." She smiled bitterly. "Except for anything real." The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan felt it in his bones, the raw ache of a truth spoken aloud for the first time. It was a silence he knew too well, the space between what you have and what you need, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Sophia pushed her chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the marble floor. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice strained. She turned and walked swiftly out of the dining hall, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Nathan's instincts tugged at him. He hesitated, glancing at Andrew, who had returned to his phone, his expression unreadable. The weight of indifference hung around him like a cloak. She shouldn't be alone right now, Nathan thought. He didn't know why he felt it so deeply, but he did. He found Sophia in the garden, the frost-covered hedges glistening under the moonlight. She stood by a stone bench, her arms wrapped around herself. The cold air turned her breath into mist, each exhale a silent plea to the universe. He approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the snow-dusted grass. "Sophia." She turned, her eyes shimmering under the pale light. "Nathan," she said softly, as if she'd been expecting him. "Are you all right?" he asked, the words inadequate but sincere. She let out a shaky breath. "I'm not sure I know what that means anymore." He didn't respond immediately, the chill seeping through his coat, but it couldn't touch the warmth of empathy he felt for her. "It's okay not to be okay." She laughed quietly, the sound fragile. "That's a luxury I don't think I have." They stood in silence, the cold air pressing in, yet the space between them felt warmer than it should. The world inside the estate was polished, perfect, and hollow. Out here, under the night sky, the imperfections were allowed to breathe. "I saw how you looked at the staff," Nathan said finally. "Like you were trying to find someone who wasn't performing." Her eyes glistened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I've been surrounded by people my entire life, Nathan, but I've never felt more alone." The raw honesty in her voice struck him, a familiar chord he thought had long since faded. He took a step closer, his own walls cracking. "I know what that feels like, being surrounded by noise but trapped in silence." Her gaze met his, surprise flickering through her tears. "How do you survive it?" He exhaled slowly, his breath a mist between them. "You find someone who sees you, really sees you, and you hold on to that connection no matter how small." Sophia's lip trembled, and she nodded. "I don't know if I have that." "You do," he said gently. "Sometimes it starts with a conversation, like this one." A silence settled between them, not empty, but full of possibility. For the first time, the cold didn't feel so biting, and the loneliness didn't seem so absolute. "Thank you, Nathan," she whispered. "For what?" "For not pretending." He gave a faint smile. "Sometimes, being real is the only thing we can do." The frost glistened around them, the air sharp but clear. Two souls, seemingly unconnected, had found each other in the cold, their shared loneliness weaving a fragile thread of understanding. It was a beginning, small but precious. And in that moment it was enough. The moon had climbed higher in the sky by the time Nathan and Sophia returned to the house. The warmth of the estate's interior felt oppressive after the clarity of the cold garden air. The grand hallway, with its towering columns and gleaming marble floors, loomed around them, echoing with the absence of genuine life. Sophia's footsteps were light but hesitant, as though she were afraid the world she inhabited might shatter beneath her feet. Nathan walked beside her, his presence steady and grounding. He had no right to be there, a chauffeur escorting a billionaire's daughter through her own home, but neither of them seemed to care. As they passed the dining hall, Sophia paused, her gaze drifting toward the room where the remnants of their earlier meal lay in polished perfection. The staff had cleared away the plates, the chairs neatly aligned, the candles extinguished. It was as though no one had ever been there. "Sometimes I wonder," Sophia murmured, her voice barely audible. "If I disappeared, would anything in this house change?" Nathan turned to her, the question settling into his chest like a lead weight. He'd never been good with words, but something about her vulnerability drew out a courage he didn't know he possessed. "It would change for me," he said softly. She looked up at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. The walls she had carefully built seemed to waver, the cracks spreading ever so slightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice fragile. "Because I see you," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Not the wealth, not the perfect manners, but you. The person behind all of this." Her breath caught, her eyes shining with unshed tears. No one had ever said that to her before, not in a way that mattered, not in a way that felt true. The people around her saw the Lennox name, the wealth, the influence. But Nathan's words cut through all of that, reaching the part of her she kept hidden even from herself. Before she could respond, a voice broke through the fragile silence. "Sophia." They turned to see a tall man standing in the shadows of the hallway. His dark hair was neatly combed, his suit tailored to perfection, but his eyes held a cold sharpness that chilled the air. His smile was polite, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Leo," Sophia said, her voice flattening. "I didn't know you were here." Leo Lennox, her older cousin, stepped forward, his gaze flicking to Nathan before settling back on Sophia. "I arrived this afternoon. I thought I'd surprise you." The tension between them was palpable. Nathan straightened, his instincts humming with unease. Leo's presence filled the space with an authority that felt more like ownership. Sophia's hands clenched at her sides. "Surprise me? Or check up on me?" Leo's smile thinned. "Is there a difference?" Nathan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. The same rehearsed tone, the same hollow civility he'd seen in the staff. It radiated from Leo in waves. This wasn't a man who saw Sophia as family. He saw her as a piece on a chessboard, a role to be managed. "Your father is worried about you," Leo continued, his voice low and controlled. "You know how important appearances are." Sophia's shoulders stiffened. "I'm tired of living for appearances." A flicker of irritation crossed Leo's face before it vanished behind his polished mask. "We all have roles to play, Sophia." Nathan's fists curled at his sides, a slow burn of anger igniting in his chest. He had seen this kind of control before, the kind that used love as leverage, that demanded obedience disguised as concern. "She doesn't have to play any role," Nathan said before he could stop himself. Leo's gaze snapped to Nathan, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to say that?" Nathan met his glare without flinching. "Someone who doesn't believe people should be treated like pawns." The air grew heavier, the silence stretching. Leo's smile returned, but it was razor-sharp now. "Be careful where you tread, driver. This isn't your world." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't need to, the truth was already laid bare. This wasn't about wealth or status. It was about control, and Leo was determined to maintain it. Sophia's voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Nathan's right. I'm done pretending." Leo's expression darkened, the mask slipping for just a moment to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "You're making a mistake, Sophia." She lifted her chin, her eyes glistening but resolute. "Maybe, but at least it'll be my mistake." Leo stared at her for a long moment, then stepped back, his smile returning to its practiced curve. "Suit yourself. But remember, family always knows best." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the hall, each step a reminder of the world Sophia was trying to escape. Nathan exhaled slowly, the tension easing just a fraction. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Sophia nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I think so. You don't have to face him alone," Nathan said, his voice steady. She looked at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "I know." For the first time, the weight of her loneliness felt just a little lighter. The cracks in her world were widening, but maybe, just maybe, those cracks were letting in the light. They stood together in the empty hallway, the grand house looming around them. But for the first time, Sophia felt like she wasn't trapped inside it. And that made all the difference. The shadows in the hallway seemed to deepen as Leo's footsteps faded away, leaving only the silence of the grand estate. The weight of his parting words, "Family always knows best," lingered like a cold hand on Sophia's shoulder. Her chest felt tight, as if the walls were closing in, ready to smother the fragile resolve she just found. Nathan shifted beside her, his presence a quiet source of strength. His eyes, dark with concern, searched her face. "Do you want to sit down?" he asked softly. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Together, they walked to the drawing room, a space dominated by antique furniture, oil paintings, and a fireplace that crackled half-heartedly against the winter chill. The firelight danced on the walls, casting fleeting warmth in a room that otherwise felt lifeless. Sophia sank onto the velvet sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Nathan hesitated, then sat in the armchair opposite her, his posture carefully composed. He wasn't sure if he should stay, but leaving her alone felt unthinkable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unsaid things, with questions Nathan wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Finally, she broke the stillness. "I'm so tired, Nathan." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice low. "Of what? Of this life. Of the expectations. Of the constant pressure to be someone I'm not." She looked up, her eyes shimmering. "I've spent years pretending, thinking if I played my role well enough, it would all feel real eventually. But it never does." Nathan's heart clenched. Her words echoed his own thoughts, the ones he buried behind his quiet exterior. He knew the feeling of wearing masks, of performing for the world even when everything inside felt broken. "You don't have to keep pretending," he said gently. "You deserve more than this." She laughed bitterly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "It's not that simple. Leo isn't just my cousin. He's my father's right hand, the one who ensures the Lennox family image stays perfect. He watches everything I do. One wrong step, and he'll make sure I regret it." Nathan's jaw tightened. "That's not family. That's control." She met his gaze, a flicker of hope and fear in her eyes. "I wish my father could see it that way." "Have you tried talking to him?" Nathan asked. She shook her head, her voice wavering. "He's always busy, always away. And when he is here, it's like he's already made up his mind about who I'm supposed to be. I'm a reflection of the family name, not a person." Her words hung in the air, the ache of them settling into Nathan's chest. He'd spent most of his life feeling invisible, a tool to be used but never acknowledged. But Sophia's loneliness was a different kind of prison, gilded and suffocating. "Your father might not see you," Nathan said carefully, "but that doesn't mean you're not worth seeing." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something she hadn't found in anyone else. In that moment, Nathan felt a deep responsibility, not just to comfort her, but to remind her that her worth wasn't tied to her family's expectations. Suddenly, Sophia's expression shifted. A thought, dark and determined, took root in her mind. "I need to know the truth, Nathan." He frowned. "The truth? There's more to this," she said, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. "The way Leo watches me, the way my father keeps his distance, it feels like they're hiding something. Something about me, about my place in all of this." Nathan leaned back, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Do you really want to know?" She nodded, determination sparking in her eyes. "I have to. If there's something they're not telling me, I can't keep living in this lie. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. How do we find out? Sophia stood, her shoulders squaring as if bracing herself for a storm. My father's study. Leo thinks he's careful, but I know there are files, letters, something that can give me answers. Nathan's instincts flared with caution. Sophia, if Leo catches us. I don't care, she interrupted, her voice firm. I need to know who I am beyond this charade. He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Then I'm with you. The study was tucked away at the end of a long corridor, the door a dark, imposing presence. The air in the hallway felt colder here, as if the secrets hidden behind the mahogany panels leached the warmth from the space. Sophia's fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Nathan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. We'll do this together. She nodded, exhaling slowly before turning the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in shadow. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting pale beams over the massive desk and towering bookshelves. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air. Sophia moved to the desk, her hands trailing over the smooth surface. There has to be something here, she whispered. Nathan started searching the shelves, his eyes scanning the titles, the locked drawers. He found a small key hidden beneath a stack of papers and handed it to Sophia. Her hands were steady now, fueled by a desperate need for answers. She unlocked the top drawer and pulled it open. Inside were files thick with documents. She rifled through them, her breath catching as she read the headings. Financial reports, property deeds, and then, near the bottom, a thick envelope labeled confidential. Her heart pounded as she pulled it out and unfolded the papers inside. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. What is it? Nathan asked, his voice tight with concern. She looked at him, her hands shaking. It's about me, my trust fund, my inheritance. Her voice cracked. Leo's been controlling it. My father gave him power over everything until I prove myself worthy. Nathan's jaw clenched, rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. They've been using you. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. All this time I thought I was failing them, but they set me up to fail. Nathan moved to her side, his voice low and fierce. You're not a failure. You're not a pawn in their game. You deserve the truth, and you deserve your freedom. Sophia's eyes met his, a spark of resolve igniting in the depths of her sadness. Then let's take it back. Together, they stood in the shadows of the study, the truth finally revealed, the lies shattered. And as the storm of betrayal raged inside her, Sophia knew she wasn't facing it alone. Nathan was by her side, and for the first time in her life she felt seen. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the documents, the weight of the truth pressing on her like an avalanche. The neatly typed words on the pages, her trust fund, Leo's control over her inheritance, blurred through her tears. Years of confusion, of feeling inadequate and trapped, finally made sense. This was never about her worth. It was about control, about keeping her under the family's thumb. Nathan's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts. Sophia, he said softly, steady and grounding. We can't stay here. Someone will come looking. She nodded, taking a shaky breath and folding the papers back into the envelope. Her mind was a storm, fear and fury clashing with each other. The trust she had in her family was unraveling thread by thread, but there wasn't time to process the betrayal. Not yet. They slipped out of the study, the corridor stretching out before them like a dark tunnel. Each step echoed, amplifying the fear lodged in her chest. The air in the estate felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves knew the secrets she carried. As they rounded the corner toward the main hall, a cold voice shattered the silence. Going somewhere? Leo stepped out of the shadows, his face twisted into a mask of smug certainty. The polished veneer he always wore had cracked, revealing the steel beneath. His eyes glinted, reflecting the dim light like a predator's. Sophia's heart slammed into her ribs. She tightened her grip on the envelope, her breath caught in her throat. Nathan instinctively moved closer, his posture tense, protective. Leo's gaze flicked to the papers in her hand, his smile curling into something cruel. I see you've been snooping. That was a mistake, Sophia. Her voice shook, but she lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze. The mistake was thinking you could control me forever. Leo's eyes narrowed, the smile slipping. You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't just about money. It's about preserving the family's legacy. Your legacy? She shot back, her voice gaining strength. Not mine. He took a step forward, his tone low and menacing. You're walking away from everything. Do you really think you can survive without the family's protection? Nathan's voice, calm but edged with fury, cut through the tension. Maybe she doesn't need protection. Maybe she just needs freedom. Leo turned to Nathan, his lip curling. This doesn't concern you, driver. It concerns me when someone is being used and lied to, Nathan said, his voice even. She's not a pawn in your power games. Leo's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his temple. He took another step forward, his presence looming. Sophia, listen to me. You walk away now and you lose everything. The money, the connections, everything that makes you you. Sophia's fingers dug into the envelope, her pulse roaring in her ears. The fear clawed at her, whispering that he was right, that without the safety net of wealth, she would fall into oblivion. But then she felt Nathan beside her, solid and unwavering, and another voice rose above the fear. You are enough even without the fortune, without the name. Sophia took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with cold resolve. I'd rather lose everything than lose myself. Leo's eyes blazed with fury. You'll regret this. No, she said, her voice clear and steady. I won't. She turned to Nathan, her heart pounding. Let's go. Nathan nodded, his eyes full of pride and determination. They stepped past Leo, who stood frozen in his fury, his threats dissolving into the empty air. The cold night air wrapped around them as they stepped out onto the front steps of the estate. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the grounds. The gravel crunched under their feet as they walked toward the black sedan parked at the edge of the driveway. Nathan opened the door for her, and she slid inside, the leather seat cold against her back. He got in beside her, the door closing with a finality that felt like breaking a chain. As they pulled away from the mansion, Sophia stared out the window. The lights of the estate faded behind them, swallowed by the darkness. Each mile they put between them and that house loosened the grip of fear in her chest. Where do you want to go? Nathan asked softly. She turned to him, the shadows playing across his face. Somewhere real, she whispered. Somewhere I can breathe. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. I know just the place. They drove for hours, the silence between them comfortable. The city lights faded into stretches of open road and fields dusted with frost. When Nathan finally turned onto a narrow path, the first blush of dawn painted the horizon in soft hues of pink and gold. They arrived at a small lake surrounded by tall pines. The water was still, reflecting the pastel sky. Nathan turned off the engine, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the world holding its breath. Sophia stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. She walked to the edge of the lake, the frozen ground crunching beneath her boots. The vastness of the sky, the stillness of the water. It was all so different from the suffocating walls of the estate. Nathan joined her, his presence steady beside her. You did it, he said quietly. You broke free. She closed her eyes, the tears finally slipping down her cheeks. I feel like I'm finally waking up. He didn't say anything, just let the moment be hers. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the fragments of her old life. When she opened her eyes, the sun was rising, casting light over the world. She turned to Nathan, a genuine, unguarded smile breaking across her face. Thank you, she whispered, for being here. He smiled back, his eyes warm. You don't have to thank me. We both needed this. They stood together as the dawn unfolded, two souls once trapped in silence, now finding freedom in shared understanding. And as the light grew stronger, Sophia knew she was finally ready to step into the unknown, with courage, with hope, and with the knowledge that she was, at last, truly seen. The golden light of dawn spread across the still lake, painting everything in hues of amber and rose. The frost on the pine needles glistened like tiny diamonds, and the air was sharp, clear, and invigorating. For the first time in years, Sophia felt like she could breathe. Each inhale filled her lungs with the promise of possibility. Each exhale released the burden of expectations that had weighed her down for so long. Nathan stood beside her, hands tucked in his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full of meaning. No words were needed to acknowledge what they'd been through together. The understanding was deeper than language. Sophia turned to him, her eyes glimmering in the soft light. "It's strange," she murmured. "Everything I thought mattered. It doesn't anymore." Nathan met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, you have to lose everything you thought defined you to find out who you really are." She nodded, his words settling deep into her heart. "I spent so long being afraid of losing my safety net. But now that it's gone, I feel free." He smiled faintly. "Freedom has a way of showing up when we stop trying to control everything." A breeze stirred the surface of the lake, the gentle ripples mirroring the changes within her. The chains that once held her, the expectations, the lies, the need for approval were broken. In their place was something fragile, yet unbreakable. A sense of self-worth she hadn't known she possessed. Sophia looked down at the envelope in her hands, the incriminating documents she had taken from her father's study. The proof of Leo's manipulation, the weapon he had used to control her life. She held it up, the paper rustling in the wind. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "What are you going to do with that?" For a long moment, she stared at the documents, the weight of their meaning pressing on her. Then, with a decisive breath, she tore them in half. The sound of ripping paper was shockingly loud in the quiet morning. "I don't need it," she said, the pieces falling to the ground like autumn leaves. "I don't need revenge. I don't need to prove anything to them." Nathan watched her, admiration shining in his eyes. "That's brave." She smiled, a real unburdened smile. "Maybe for the first time, I'm finally being brave for myself." He nodded, pride evident in his expression. "What now?" Sophia's eyes lifted to the horizon, where the sun continued its ascent. "I don't know, but that's okay. I want to figure it out on my own terms." She turned to Nathan, her gaze steady. "And you? What's next for you?" He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. "I've spent so long driving other people to where they want to go. Maybe it's time I decide my own destination." She laughed softly, the sound light and free. "Sounds like we're both at the beginning of something." "Yeah," he agreed. "A new beginning." They spent the morning exploring the lake's edge, the frost crunching beneath their steps, their laughter mingling with the wind. They shared stories, of hopes, of regrets, of the small moments that shaped them. Nathan spoke of his father, a mechanic who taught him the value of steady hands and a patient heart. Sophia spoke of her mother, whose absence had left a void she was only now learning to fill with her own sense of purpose. By the time the sun climbed high, they were leaning against the car, the warmth of the engine seeping through their coats. The world felt vast and open, a canvas waiting to be painted. Nathan glanced at Sophia. "You ready to go?" She took one last look at the lake, the calm water reflecting the clear sky. "Yeah, but let's not go back to where we came from. Let's go somewhere new." He smiled, unlocking the car. "Anywhere in mind?" She shook her head, a sparkle in her eyes. "Surprise me." The road stretched before them, winding through forests and over hills, the horizon a constant promise of something more. The miles slipped away, the past receding like a fading shadow. Neither of them knew exactly where they were headed, but it didn't matter. For the first time in their lives, they were free of expectations, free of roles they no longer wanted to play. Sophia rolled down the window, the wind whipping through her hair. She laughed, the sound clear and unburdened. Nathan's smile widened, his grip on the wheel sure and steady. They were no longer a driver and a passenger. They were two people, bound by shared loneliness, shared courage, and the hope of redemption. Their paths had crossed through chance, through fate, or maybe just through the desperate need to be seen, and they were never going back to who they had been before. As the car sped forward, the sun casting long rays of light on the road ahead, Sophia closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "I'm finally free." And beside her, Nathan felt it too. The road ahead was uncertain, but together, they knew they could face whatever lay beyond the next turn. A new dawn, a new journey, and for the first time, endless possibilities.